Hi, and welcome to a new episode of the State of the Net podcast. I'm Paolo Valdemarin.
And I'm Euan Simple.
And we must apologize because you will get this episode 1 week late. Now, last week, actually, we did record an episode, but then we had a little problem with one of our microphones, and we decided not to release the episode because it didn't sound very nice.
Well, that's very kind of you, Paolo, to say one of our microphones. It was my microphone. And, as a highly trained former BBC sound engineer, I should take the blame. It was my microphone. Goodness knows what was going wrong with it, but it was... But we were just chatting before we started recording this time, whether we should have just put it out and made an apology at the beginning. And, I've heard some really dire audio recordings in podcasts, but they've gone out because, in those circumstances, it's almost always because there's a guest, and getting the guest again would be difficult. But, I think there is that temptation to, well, from my perspective, try to overproduce podcasts. But from what you were saying, the degradation of the sound got worse towards the end, so it would have been just even more annoying to listen to.
Well, I must say it, coming from several generation of hi-fi enthusiasts and kind of audiophiles, I couldn't have put that out. I mean, it was just I couldn't.
Well, we used to joke about it at the World Service because we spent a long time and put a lot of effort and skill into trying to make things sound good, and then mangled them down a shortwave signal that was listened to on small transistors in deserts, and it always seemed a bit odd that we took all that time. And certainly because I spent my working day listening to, incredibly impressive and expensive loudspeakers, I tended not to get into audiophile stuff at home because, the more money you spend on that, the more likely you are to hear the mistakes that I was making at the front end. But yeah, we also knew that if there's enough rough edges in an audio recording, even if people don't know what the cause is, it eventually just gets distracting or annoying, or they just have less pleasure from listening to it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is interesting, the fact that podcasting has been around forever, but it has been taking off in the last few years, and you have a lot of production these days. And I must say that most of what I'm listening to, the quality is actually pretty good.
And it's so much easier nowadays, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Because you can buy a pretty decent microphone, and you have a full-blown recording studio.
Well, and you don't even need the studio in that sense, because I was just talking to, I think, our mutual friend Laurent, who does a podcast and television stuff as well. He was suggesting that as I embark on my new career as a lorry driver. I'm just trying to remember whether we've talked about that in the podcast or whether we did it last week and people won't know what the hell I'm going on about. But anyway, I'm about to embark on an additional career as a lorry driver. And Laurent was saying that, that would be great material for, I certainly a blog, which I had anticipated doing, but also a podcast. And he now has a portable set of kit that he's able to use wherever he is and just grab people and interview them. So, I'm going to look into the possibilities of doing that. So you don't even need a fixed space in order to be able to do it these days.
Oh, no. I mean, as I demonstrated for the last couple of episodes, you could just...
in the cupboard.
I came out of the closet this week because I'm back in London and I'm not recording from my walk-in closet in Italy. But... yeah, you can very easily do that. There is something that I've been thinking about recently. I'm still going through the book about Silicon Valley and how at the beginning of a revolution, and in the case of the history of Silicon Valley, there are two. There is first the PC and then the internet. All the principles are essentially amateurs because there isn't an established discipline. So all those who were creating the first computers were just figuring things out. There were no computer experts. Yeah. And the same at the beginning of the web as we know it. That part I was more active into. You would just view source of web pages and figure out how to do them. You wouldn't study how to do that. You would just figure it out.
You couldn't do a degree in social media in those days, Paolo.
No, you can't. But it is true that I'm working on the production of digital platforms today, and it is a much more complicated thing. And no one of us would think of starting a company producing computers or smartphones, because they have become very, very complicated things. So as a product mature, the level of complexity increases, and you have more and more specialization. You need to be a bigger and bigger company to be able to tackle that kind of problems.
Yes, but, and this totally relates to a conversation I had about organizations and what I call the perils of professionalism. And this is the growth of expertise in a particular subject, say HR or communications or whatever, that means it ends up developing its own norms and its own processes and its own dogma, for want of a better word, that then makes it cut adrift from the original purpose for which it was intended, and it becomes an end in itself. And that certainly worries me about social media, that it's got turned into a thing, and a thing that people feel they need to be experts in or charge lots of money for or whatever. Whereas actually it's really still, for me, about people having online conversations about interesting topics. And, I think the same is true of the podcasting thing, that it can become much higher end and more complex, but it would be good if it retained some of its original authenticity.
It is actually where I was sort of heading on something like podcasting. I mean, how complicated can you make it? I mean, really, it will always be about somebody sitting in front of the microphone, or maybe of a camera, and recording something and then posting it. I mean, it's
Well, but you see, this is also part of why I've sort of gone off listening to BBC podcasts, because, well, I never really listened to them at all, but they're, to my eyes, ears, overproduced. And there's this intermediary, this professional broadcaster who's sort of getting between me and the subject. And they're not conversational like the podcast that I like listening to. So even if the technology doesn't get complicated, you can overcomplicate the process. And, we've had this discussion even about editing the podcasts afterwards. When I did the podcast with Megan Murray, we didn't edit them, basically. We just... If we got stuck or if we stumbled, we just commented on that and moved on. And we tried really hard not to leave too many long gaps as we thought about stuff. But we basically just recorded it as live. So, again, it's just that balancing act. And having spent much of my career in radio de-umming inarticulate presenters, I know it can get... I just paused before I said that. I know it can get irritating.
I won't edit this pose, I promise. But in any case, I think that it is interesting how technology evolves. Yes, it is true. I think that it is true to be aware and beware of professionalism when it essentially it's just people profiting from complexity.
Yes.
Yes. I mean, I guess that the point is, no one is suggesting that you don't need to be you don't need to have a huge collection of professionals to build an iPhone.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
It's not something
it's not
that
a hobbyist.
The two of us. It's not the time the two of us. Let's meet next week and build one.
No.
I mean, it's just it has become. 40 years ago, we could have met next weekend and built a computer. We could have bought a kit and built a computer.
Well, you still can with a Raspberry Pi.
Yes, but it's not an iPhone.
This is true.
You can still build some very basic computers, absolutely. But now we have iPhones, and you walk around with an iPhone, not with a Raspberry Pi.
So this kind of relates to the whole thing about teaching kids coding, doesn't it? Because part of me thinks it's a good thing that they get their heads around the basics of what's being delivered through their phones. But equally, I also know that as we move forward, less and less people will actually have to have hands-on experience of code as such. There'll be intermediate apps that do much of it for us. And but then if that does become the case, I worry that we don't remember... It's a bit like photography. photography's become so easy that people don't need to necessarily understand the principles of taking a film camera photograph, you know?
Well, I mean, okay. From one point of view, I think that the most useful thing about teaching kids to code is that you learn how the logic of a computer works. And that will be true whatever you will do with a computer. I mean, if you have some basic understanding of how you create software, even if it's really basic, you have a completely different approach to software than if you don't. Yeah. I mean, there are even simpler. I always think that my first introduction to logic was when my father taught me how our home hi-fi system worked. You know, what was connected to what the cables were, how did you test this, how you test that. And, you know, it's very basic logic. It's basically the sound goes from here to there, from there to there, from there to there, gets amplified, and then you go to the speakers and then you hear it out loud. But the concept of learning that there is a logic connection, and if you want to figure out what is wrong, you test this and you test that and you test that, it's a huge lesson, and that is applicable to whatever you do. I
was going to say, not just computing. It's interesting because I spoke yesterday to David Weinberger, and we got into the issues around the ethics of AI and machine learning, and, you know, my constant theme of the ideology of algorithms. And he made an interesting point, and it's related to this one we've just been talking about computing, that up to a point, it is the outcome that matters. And his point with the AI was, in a way, rather than fretting about the biases or the ways in which the code is constructed and the motives of those who construct it, if the outcome is a positive one, and that's a very big question, and what you mean by positive is a very movable feast. But if the consensus is that the outcome of the tool, the software, the system is one that moves humanity forwards, then that's what matters, rather than the way it was constructed. And I suppose it's similar to the argument about computing.
Well, I guess I'm just hearing a tiny slice of the conversation. I think that the reason why you need to understand how the system works and not just to look at the outcome is that if the outcome is not good, you need to fix the system somehow. So knowing how it works,
that was my pushback. And, you know, but the thing is, you know, David's just thought about this an awful lot, and he was making it, and I hope I'm not paraphrasing him unfairly. And there was certainly, to me, sense in the argument, because it was really around the fact that we're going to struggle to keep up. You know, even when you said a moment ago that computers, to some extent, will always work the same way, I'm not sure they will. You know, once AI and systems that are self-learning start to, you know, we tend to anthropomorphize this stuff and assume that it will be intelligent in the same way as we are. It may not be, and it may design things totally differently with different principles, and, you know.
I mean, look, I was referring to some basic situations like that, you know, concept like to the same type of, if to action, you always have the same type of reaction when you deal with a computer. So I hope that even once our operating system will be turned completely in AIs, they will, you know, you will switch on the computer, it will come on every time. It's not like that sometimes it will, sometimes it won't, based on how the AI feel that day, I hope.
Well, I mean, I'm not sure we will sit in front of a computer that we expect to turn on.
Or we will sit inside a computer.
Or have it embedded in us,
Let's say that getting some kind of predictable outcome from a machine is something that, at least for now, is still true. Yes, it might not always be. Can you imagine smart, moody devices that sometimes they work, sometimes they don't, just because they don't want to?
Well, that's how many people I know perceive their computers currently. It's a personal battle for many of them. Yeah.
Yeah, they take it personally. It's not that it's not working. It's not working too.
That's right. It's deliberately making my life miserable. But the other thing that was really interesting in that conversation, we were talking. He was saying that if you throw a bunch of photographs at AI, and they're increasingly doing this without pre-learning. They're not sort of teaching the AI in advance. They're throwing a lot of stuff at it and asking for an outcome of whatever sort. And he was saying that they've begun that when you do that, the AI starts to identify edges in photographs, which he was finding philosophically interesting because, like me, he had assumed or begun to wonder whether the whole idea of boundaries, borders, whatever, was an aspect of the human brain and our desire to label things and to have a definition of me or you or an edge to that building rather than just some sort of grey mush of atomic energy. But the computers were ending up in a similar position where they were identifying edges. And so we were sort of just wondering whether, is that because humans, at some level, even at a deep level, programmed the computers so it's likely to see, notice, identify the sorts of things that we do? Or is it the fact that the photographs that it has been fed will have been taken by people who tend to like clear edges? You don't tend to, as David said, you don't tend to take many pictures of fog. But, it's just, again, it's that really interesting junction we're at where it may not end up mimicking our sense of our sort of intelligence and our sense of priorities and may begin to outstrip us.
Or, and it might be even more surprising, it might mimic our intelligence because it would be a form of life.
Yes.
And maybe all forms of life tend to, any form of life will probably try to find edges because it's a useful thing to notice. Basically, when you learn to see, being able to see the edge of the cliff is useful.
Yes.
And if you think it's not just humans, all form of life identify edges to some degree.
That's true, isn't it? Well, yeah.
I can't really speak for viruses and other kind of, but let's say that probably we can assume that many forms of life. So what is interesting is that are we creating a new form of life? And if we are, will this new type of life just start behaving and becoming what all other forms of life are, or at least known forms of life are in the universe? Science fiction. I'm not saying that all aliens will actually breathe air and speak English like in Star Trek, but there are many theories around some type of common traits in carbon-based forms of life. Now, I wonder if a silicon-based form of life might actually somehow go along.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Because in a way, you talked earlier about the original pioneers in computing and the Silicon Valley mentality and the optimism of it and the fact that we have this instinct desire to make things better, which in some ways has to be preceded by the assumption that they're not right as they are. And that idea that evolution is on a linear path to somewhere better than where it's been may not be true. And that again might be interesting, the idea that what we value and what we see as priorities, even though, and I get totally what you're saying about there may be some elements of carbon-based life that are fundamental that every bit of life on the planet, including artificial life, ends up following. But we also have layered that with all sorts of stories, the myths around religions and the feeling that we need to do something about feeling so miserable much of the time, rather than just accepting being miserable and seeing it as part of life, and that you wouldn't know when you were happy if you weren't miserable some of the time. So it's interesting because, beforehand we were talking about fake news and the degree to which we've made up stories since man has told stories, and absolute factual bottom line truth is a very movable feast. Even when you have factual truth, it gets presented in different ways depending on your perspective. And, again, I've just this morning posted a blog post quoting Yogi Berra's great phrase that whenever you come to a fork in the path, take it. And it's the idea that whichever direction we head in or whichever decision we make, it's how we respond to what happens next that will determine whether it was a good or a bad decision. And that is an interesting one to think about in terms of technology and whether it retains that level of adaptability and accepting consequences rather than fighting consequences.
I just remembered something that I actually don't remember where I read this, but this whole idea that we have today that we're kind of striving for some better future, and maybe we're struggling with this a little bit at the moment, but I mean, for the last few hundred years, we have been waiting for a better future. Basically, tomorrow is better than yesterday, and it's always the case. And it has been the case. I mean, humanity has grown and changed dramatically in the last few hundred years. But historically, this was not always true. I mean, throughout the Middle Ages, there was this idea that the past was much better than the present. Mm-hmm. That the old days were much better.
There are some people around who vote for things like Brexit who think the same way, but yes.
Yeah, okay. but actually, even in Roman times, I mean, there was this concept that there was a glorious past, and now we need to suffer.
Yes.
Which is completely different today, yes. Because I mean, even with the Brexiteers. They're still doing it because they're expecting tomorrow to be better.
Yes.
It probably won't, but
just a different concept of better. Yes.
Well, I also probably it depends at what is the scale you're using, yes. In the sense that
exactly.
If we look at planet Earth, tomorrow will probably be better for a lot of people than. Probably for a minority living in the Western world tomorrow. Basically, right now we're clinging on today, hoping that tomorrow is going to be like today.
So I mean, this is really interesting because this is what worries me about technology, that we are inevitably encoding even one group's perception of what better is into the systems. And, if you look at it on a global scale, as you just sort of took us in that direction, the East has had a very different idea of what better is than the West for several hundred, if not thousands of years. Yeah. And you can almost see this ideological difference between what China sees as ideal and what the West sees as ideal. And, if our technology is beginning to outstrip us and is imbued with one or other of those value systems. It's interesting.
Well, it's as far as AI is concerned, there is a concern in the Western world that China might overtake or might move faster because they have much easier access to data. Mm-hmm. Which we don't have here because we have concern around privacy and all kind of ethical
old-fashioned ideas.
They just that they don't have. Now, if it is true, and it is partially true, that the evolution of AI is based on having access to data, they might be able to evolve faster. And where it is going to take the planet, we don't know.
And it does, and I hope my any American friends who are listening to this will forgive me, it does sort of beg the question that where we're heading now with our technology is a good place. And it's largely based on American values and assumptions about progress and the idea.
It's not like the good values that we have here in Cambridge, where we respect privacy of Facebook users.
Well, yeah, but broaden that to the West. I was meaning in the sense that most of the technology is being generated in the States, I guess, still. Yeah. even down.
Oh, did you read that there are something like 2,000 American newspapers that are still not visible from Europe because of GDPR?
Newspapers?
Yeah, like online version of the newspaper, like the LA Times, for example,
really?
is still because when GDPR came into effect, they were not supporting it, and they just blocked access.
Right.
And everybody was thinking, okay, they will just fix it. They didn't do it in time. But this has been 2 months went by, and they're still not visible. So there is something like 2,000 news websites in America that are not visible anymore from Europe because they couldn't be bothered to support privacy regulations.
I'm so biting my lip about whether that's a good or a bad thing, but I won't go there. But it's exactly that point. What seems like an innocuous, GDPR is not an innocuous idea, but that is an unforeseen consequence of a bit of legislation that sort of makes sense to one group of people in one set of circumstances. It's.
Well, I think that this is something for all of us to think about. And I actually think that this episode was slightly better than the one we recorded last week.
Well, we're the only ones who will ever know, Paolo. So I think we can confidently assert that this was so much better than the last one.
This was,
and if you thought this one was bad, you should have heard the last one.
Yeah, you would definitely. So, for all of you who are listening to this now, you have no idea how lucky
both of you. Yes.
Congratulations. And as usual, please remember to recommend to all your friends to start listening to podcasts because they are an interesting thing, even if they are overproduced sometimes. and
also to review or comment on LinkedIn, on iTunes, because that's quite a big. It gives the podcast a boost.
Do that.
Yeah.
Yep.
Cool.
And if you want to get in touch, if you want to give us any feedback, you can find us online. Where are you?
I'm at euansample.com.
You can find me online on my blog, which has the URL is my family name, Valdemarin. It's val.eemar.in. So thank you everybody for listening, and see you soon.
Bye-bye.